For most of the modern world, this was supposed to be impossible. A NATO country threatening another NATO country, not in secret, not as a rumor, but as an option openly discussed from the White House. And yet here we are. The President of the United States is talking about acquiring Greenland, a territory that belongs to Denmark, a US ally, with military force explicitly left on the table. This is not a movie plot. This is not Cold War history. This is happening now. The argument, again, sounds familiar. National security, the Arctic, Russia, China. But when the strongest power in the world begins to redefine alliances as obstacles, something deeper is shifting. Rules that once felt permanent suddenly feel negotiable. If you want to understand how global order actually unravels, not in textbooks, but in real time, stay with me. Because this moment is not really about Greenland. It's about power, permission, and what happens when necessity becomes a justification. To see that clearly, we have to step back and ask how this logic took hold in the first place. To understand what is truly at stake, we need to strip this story down to its core. This is not a debate about land. It is a debate about power, how it is defined, justified, and exercised. The United States frames Greenland as a national security priority, a strategic Arctic position, a shield against Russian and Chinese influence, a piece on a global chessboard. Europe hears something very different. A challenge to sovereignty, a violation of borders, a direct threat to the logic that holds NATO together. And Denmark, quietly but firmly, hears an existential warning. If an ally can be pressured this way, then no alliance is truly safe. What makes this moment so dangerous is not the idea itself, but the mechanism behind it. Security is no longer something to be shared. It is something to be claimed. Once that logic takes hold, every relationship becomes conditional. Every rule becomes flexible. And that raises the unavoidable question. How did the world reach a point where this logic feels acceptable, inevitable? To answer that, we have to look backward before we can look forward. To see where this logic comes from, we have to place Greenland back into history. For most of the post-Cold War era, the Arctic was peripheral, frozen, remote, politically quiet. Security there was assumed, not contested. That assumption is now gone. Melting ice has changed the map without redrawing borders. New sea routes are becoming possible. New strategic calculations are emerging. And with them, renewed interest from Russia and China, a fact repeatedly invoked to justify urgency. From Washington's perspective, Greenland shifts from distant territory to strategic hinge. From Europe's perspective, it remains bound by sovereignty, law, and alliance norms. Two worldviews, operating on different timelines, now collide. This is how history works in cycles. Geography stays still. Technology changes. Power recalculates. What once looked like cooperation begins to look like vulnerability. And when vulnerability is framed as risk, pressure follows. That pressure does not arrive suddenly. It builds quietly, then speaks loudly. And eventually, it produces moments, sharp, public, destabilizing moments, where theory turns into confrontation. That brings us to the first real shock in this story. The shock did not come as a formal declaration. It came as something far more destabilizing. Normalization. First, the language shifted. Greenland was no longer discussed as a partner's territory, but as an asset, a need, a strategic requirement. Then came the signals. A US military intervention elsewhere, elite troops seizing a foreign leader, a reminder, not subtle, of what American power can still do when it chooses to act. And almost immediately after, a map appeared, Greenland colored in red, white, and blue. One word attached to it, soon. That single image traveled faster than any policy paper ever could, because it said what diplomacy avoided saying out loud. This was no longer abstract. It was personal, and it was frightening. European leaders responded with rare unity, rallying behind Denmark. They invoked sovereignty, territorial integrity, the basic rules of the international system. But here is the deeper meaning of this moment. When reassurance has to be spoken this loudly, confidence has already cracked. If this escalation unsettles you, it should, because once power is displayed casually, restraint stops being assumed. And after that, every next step becomes easier. This is where we need to look beneath the surface. What lies beneath this moment is not impulse. It is structure. The United States is operating within a familiar internal logic. Security dominance ensures stability. Control prevents conflict. Preemption is protection. In that framework, Greenland is not a country with people and rights. It is a location, a buffer, a node in a wider system of power projection. And this is where the mechanism becomes dangerous. When security is defined unilaterally, consent becomes optional. Allies are no longer equals. They are variables. International law becomes a reference point, not a boundary. This is not new in history. Great powers often convince themselves that their strength is synonymous with order, that what is good for them is eventually good for everyone else. But alliances like NATO were built on a different premise. That security is collective. That restraint is as important as capability. That trust, once broken, cannot be recalibrated with force. The contradiction is now visible. A system designed to deter aggression is being tested from within. And systems under internal stress do not fracture quietly. They crack suddenly. That brings us to the second moment of escalation, the point where tension turns into something far more dangerous. The second escalation is not about troops moving. It is about words refusing to retreat. When asked directly whether force could be ruled out, the answer was not reassurance. It was certainty. Nobody's going to fight the US over the future of Greenland. That sentence matters because it reframes the entire equation. Conflict is no longer judged by legality or legitimacy, but by who dares to resist. Power becomes its own proof. At the same time, defense officials spoke of contingency plans, not intentions, plans, language that normalizes preparation for the unthinkable. For allies listening closely, this was the real alarm, not ambition but inevitability. When leaders speak as if outcomes are predetermined, diplomacy loses oxygen. The Arctic, once a zone of cooperation, now feels like a pressure point. Every statement tightens it. Every refusal to de-escalate accelerates it. This is how crises evolve in modern systems. Not through dramatic announcements, but through cumulative certainty. Each step justified as rational, each reaction framed as overreaction, until suddenly there is no neutral ground left. And when that happens, the consequences stop being abstract. They become human. For the people who actually live in Greenland, this is not strategy. It is fear. If you are one of the 57,000 people on that island, power does not feel abstract. It feels loud. Distant voices deciding your future without asking you. You hear leaders laugh. You see maps where your home is recolored. You listen to talk of options and contingencies, knowing those words never land on the people who speak them. You already belong to your land, your language, your history. Kalalit Nunaat means exactly that, the land of the Greenlandic people. And yet, suddenly, others are claiming it for you. This is what geopolitical pressure does at the human level. It turns identity into uncertainty. It replaces choice with anxiety. If this unsettles you, it should, because the first casualty of great power logic is always voice. And the people most affected are the least heard. If you believe security should protect people, not erase them, remember this moment. Share it, talk about it, because silence is how power becomes normal. And what is happening here will not stay local. What happens in Greenland does not stop in Greenland. Because this is not just a territorial question, it is a signal. Across Europe, leaders hear a message about hierarchy inside NATO. That power, not partnership, ultimately decides outcomes. That security guarantees may depend on alignment, not principle. Beyond Europe, other powers are watching closely. Russia sees confirmation that force and pressure still work. China sees precedent. Security narratives can override sovereignty if the actor is strong enough. This is how norms erode, not when they are violated once, but when violations are explained away, when exceptions become logic, when allies accept special cases. The Arctic, once governed by cooperation, now risks becoming a template. If Greenland can be framed this way, others will follow. Different places, same justification. And the international system, already strained, absorbs another crack. Global order does not collapse with explosions. It weakens through imitation, through silence, through the quiet adjustment of expectations. The real danger is not escalation tomorrow. It is normalization today, and once the world adapts to that, the future narrows sharply. Which brings us to the hardest question of all. Where does this path actually lead? If this trajectory continues, the future splits into three very different paths. The first is the best-case scenario. Rhetoric cools, pressure recedes. Greenland's status is reaffirmed through dialogue, law, and alliance consensus. Security in the Arctic is addressed collectively, not unilaterally. In this outcome, NATO bends but does not break. Trust is strained, yet preserved. Power remembers restraint. The second is the middle path, and perhaps the most likely: no invasion, no annexation, but constant pressure. Greenland becomes a permanent security bargaining chip. Allies adapt quietly. Norms survive on paper, while reality shifts underneath. This is a world where stability exists, but only because everyone lowers expectations. The third path is the darkest. Force, or the credible threat of it, becomes normalized. Alliances fracture under asymmetric power. Sovereignty becomes conditional on usefulness. And the lesson spreads fast. Might does not just make right, it replaces it. History shows us something sobering. Systems do not collapse when they fail. They collapse when they succeed at the wrong logic. And whichever path unfolds will not be decided by Greenland alone. It will be decided by what the world chooses to accept next. That choice brings us to the final question: what this moment ultimately demands of us. This moment asks us to confront an uncomfortable truth. Global order is not held together by power alone. It survives because powerful nations choose restraint even when they don't have to. Greenland forces that choice into the open. If security can justify ownership, then borders become suggestions. If alliances bend to pressure, then trust becomes temporary. And if people are spoken about instead of spoken with, then freedom becomes fragile. The world is watching how this story ends, not because Greenland is large, but because the precedent is. What happens here will echo far beyond the Arctic. You and I are often told that geopolitics is distant, abstract, too complex to matter. That is a comforting illusion, because every global shift begins with moments like this. Quietly normalized, carefully justified, emotionally distant, until suddenly it is the new reality. If you want to understand power before it hardens into inevitability, stay engaged. Question narratives framed as necessity. Listen to the voices that power prefers to ignore. And if this analysis helped you see the world more clearly, share it. Because awareness is not passive. It is the first act of responsibility. This story is not over. And the next chapter may arrive sooner than we think.